Sports, developing news out of San Diego. Two naval aviators are now recovering after their jet, an EA-18 Growler, much like an F-18, plunged into the San Diego Bay. NBC4's Christian Caceres in San Diego with the investigation.
That's right. We know both pilots that were on board ejected the aircraft when it impacted the San Diego Bay that you see here behind me. Both pilots, we're told, suffered minor injuries, but now the Navy has launched an investigation to find out what happened. A military aircraft caught on camera slamming into the water in San Diego Wednesday morning. The Navy reporting it was a U.S. Navy EA-18G Growler that crashed while trying to land.
It looked kind of like a bomb from the movies. It was a boom. So at first I thought it was a bomb. No, but then I couldn't hear the airplane anymore, so I'm like, no, it's not a bomb. It was the whole airplane.
Noé Varela capturing the noise he heard on his cell phone while he was working nearby. Then you can see a big splash.
There was a smell like kind of like petroleum. And but I was like thinking it could have been just the airplane fuel.
The San Diego Harbor Police Department tells us around 10:15 this morning, reports came in of an aircraft that went into the water. At the same time, a charter boat in the area, police say, was quick to respond.
Both pilots were rescued safe, alive, unharmed, in great shape. They were picked up immediately by U.S. Customs officers.
The U.S. Coast Guard and the Harbor Police are now securing the area as the Navy begins an investigation as to what happened and if weather played a role.
I was kind of scared, to be honest. I was scared because the sound of the airplane was too close of the house where it was at.
Tonight, the identity of both pilots is unknown, but police tell us the aircraft is still in the water. They tell us the biggest challenge here is to see where exactly the aircraft crashed because the tide and the wind can easily move things around. In San Diego, Christian Caceres, NBC4 News.
I do want to head to some of the other big stories that we are following, and you might remember this video right here on your screen. 2 years after a mysterious Chinese spy balloon was shot down off the coast of South Carolina, we are learning new details about what was apparently inside. The balloon was shot down by the U.S. military over the Atlantic Ocean back on February 4th of 2023 after flying over Alaska, across the U.S., and then over to the East Coast. A report published by Newsweek now states the balloon contained technology from at least 5 American companies. The report states inside the balloon were a satellite communication module, sensors, and other sophisticated surveillance equipment, some of which was held in a foam cooler. The FBI has not responded to any questions about the report. Now, back when the balloon was first spotted, the Chinese government claimed it was a weather balloon that blew off course, but U.S. intelligence agencies found it was actually being used for spying. U.S. intelligence officials have said that the information captured by the balloon was not successfully relayed to China. I do want to discuss really all of this here and the latest developments, so let's bring in a guest again to discuss all of it. We do have Patrick Cronin, the Asia Pacific Security Chair over at the Hudson Institute. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here and help discuss this all really just a little bit further as we work to piece it all together.
You're welcome.
Of course. And first off, I do want to ask you, overall, what do you make of the contents here that were reported to be inside that balloon 2 years later?
Well, my first reaction is how little we still know publicly about the details. We do know a few specifics that the Newsweek article has now unearthed, but that's mostly because they've been talking with some of the authors or people with access to a 75-page exhaustive analysis of the contents of that espionage balloon that was shot down 2 years ago. And so, as you've mentioned, we've found out that this U.S. technology, cheap technology in many cases, the Iridium signals burst module that is like a sat phone, a cheap sat phone, sitting in a foam cooler, which is very cheap technology indeed. Think of keeping your iPhone dry. But this is technology when used for malign purposes and put together in an integrated system, and then maybe used as one facet of a multi-layered sort of global surveillance system, the Chinese are able to pick up a range of intelligence. So they were able to obviously have images, think close-up imagery, better than satellite imagery. They're able to steal and intercept signals. They're able to detect our own electronic emissions, including over military bases and installations. And the fact that they claim it was a weather balloon, that sounds like just a typical cover story that an intelligence agency like the Ministry of State Security or the People's Liberation Army would use just to deny that they are spying on the United States. The fact that it blew over the United States, the continental United States, whether that was an accident or not, in terms of the weather driving it off course, well, the reports were that it was headed for Hawaii, and we've seen these balloons, similar balloons over Guam. We've seen them over allies and friends countries, South Korea, over Japan, over Taiwan. So this is a systematic program that the PLA has been trying to exploit, develop, and especially over the past decade. And yet here we are 2 years later after this very dramatic shoot down of the balloon, and we still are eager to find out much more than we know now.
Do we know overall if these balloons do pose any sort of threat to the United States? Do we really have that answer just yet?
Well, we have contradictory statements coming out of the government, right? So the last administration claimed that whatever data collection this balloon was able to undertake was not transmitted back to China. That was what was called a high certainty intelligence finding under the Biden administration. But I'm not sure that should be the last word about whether they were successful with this. And it's certainly not the last word about this balloon surveillance program. The fact that we have heard so little about the details of this, including even now with this excellent Newsweek report, but still one that's sketchy, and it's based on a verbal discussion of a report, not the actual 75-page detailed report, we're still left wondering how much of an espionage threat this really was. This was, just because it's using cheap technology, though, doesn't mean it wasn't a sophisticated espionage attempt, in the sense that we live in a world of ubiquitous, cheap digital technology. And if you can use that and string that together for malign purposes and get access, as the Chinese have been doing through this near space access, 20 kilometers above countries of the United States, you're in a sweet spot to kind of get wide view technology coverage and to go where places where United States government didn't think you'd be going, and not to mention other governments who don't have the same early warning systems, the same ability to sort of counter surveillance. So this was a wide, a wide-eyed moment for the United States intelligence community and military community to realize this is a bigger, even if it's a cheap challenge. We don't want to use F-22s to be shooting down every little cheap spy balloon, but the spy balloons, just because they're cheap, relatively cheap, doesn't make them less of a threat.
And when you look on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see that video, and it's hard to believe it was back in February of 2023. We're talking 2 years ago. Do other countries use these kind of spy balloons? Do we have that answer?
Well, we know balloons have been used for a couple hundred years for military battlefields and for spying. We certainly know that the United States, Russia, Iran, North Korea have all used balloons for a variety of reasons to collect data, or for, if communications were to fail, for emergencies. There are a lot of different possible uses, but there's no doubt that it's not just China using them. And yet, if any individual just does a Google Scholar kind of search of academic articles written by Chinese scholars in the last 2 or 3 years on stratospheric aerostats, for instance, you'd be amazed at how many Chinese scientists seem to be working on these issues. And we know that this is a Chinese program that really, in the first part of this century, started to develop. They started to write a lot of papers in the mid-2000s, and by 2015, they were clearly starting to experiment with putting these systems up in the air, and they've been refining that program ever since.
Again, you touched on this here, but what can the U.S. kind of learn from all of this? I'm sure they are still studying the contents of the balloon even 2 years later, and probably will be for a while. They're also, I'm sure, keeping an eye out for any other balloons that might fly over the U.S. So what can actually be learned from this?
Well, the first thing to recognize is that this technology is tighten export controls and to make sure that the export licenses for any technology are restricted to people who are not end users that are going to try to kill us or to try to defeat us in a conflict. That is, you don't want to send them to the Chinese military. We're not really going to know that information. There are too many cutout organizations, too many indirect routes, too many third parties that can intercede. Think of the tariff problem we're facing right now in terms of how do you control these things. So let's recognize that while we want to tighten export controls, it's never going to be adequate for this kind of basic technology, which is ubiquitous, is widely available, and is not just developed here by the United States, and it's in the hands of private sectors around the world. So we have to defend ourselves better, right? We have to make sure that we understand that our communications, our electronic emissions, our physical airfields and nuclear silos are protected from the kinds of surveillance that we put deception in decoys and use other ways to essentially mask what we're doing around the most sensitive defense and security installations, critical infrastructure. And we can do that at relatively low cost. We don't have to spend a fortune, on some new sort of scheme. There are cheaper ways to essentially use maskirovka, deception techniques here to make it difficult for the Chinese or any other potential adversary to know exactly what we're doing, to hear what we're doing, to see what we're doing.
All right, Patrick, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here. Anything else you want to add before I let you go?
Well, one thing I would just add is that we don't know to what extent this intelligence might relate to flying over the nuclear silos, but there is an ongoing competition, an element of the competition between the U.S. and China in the nuclear domain, because we see China both for the first time in decades expanding their nuclear force, and maybe wanting to learn more from how we essentially have constructed our own nuclear forces so they can build them one better, if you will. And this is the revelation of the large new building that's 10 times the size of the Pentagon with nuclear shelters that the Chinese are building now outside of Beijing, as well as the missile silos in Western China that they're building. And then finally, I'd relate this to the anti-corruption sort of tactics of Xi Jinping that have taken down two of his former defense ministers and a slew of other senior officers in just the last 3 years. And I relate this to that because the Strategic Support Force, which Xi Jinping set up as one of his first innovations in military reform 10 years ago, was aimed at essentially integrating these new high technologies together so that you could move from kind of the mechanized warfare idea to informationized, to intelligentized warfare, cyber, space, electronic communications. And yet he had to reorganize that again after this balloon incident. And maybe that relates to both corruption or not understanding whether these scientists and these geeks, if you will, who are working for the PLA were clearing everything that they were doing. So there are a lot of questions that we don't know about. What does this really mean about what China wants on the battlefield? We know they want escalation dominance. They want to deny us the ability to keep potentially having nuclear escalation dominance so that we can intervene on behalf of, say, Taiwan in a crisis. They want to deny that. They actually want to achieve it. But in the meantime, as they organize and spend and modernize, they're creating new centers of corruption and potentially elements of the military that are detached from the party leadership and from Xi Jinping's command. And those raise the vulnerabilities on the Chinese side. So and maybe the intelligence community has not released more of this report because they don't want the Chinese to know how much we know about their systems, about their problems and vulnerabilities, or conversely, how much we don't know, and therefore give them another head start about how to refine their ability to spy on us and potentially to shape a battlefield if a conflict were to break out.
All right, Patrick Cronin, thank you again for taking the time to join us here and help break it all down. We appreciate it.